the Harris Football Podcast with your host, Christopher Harris.
Here we go. Welcome in. Hello to Jose Cabilla. Best wishes. I'm Chris Harris. This is the Harris Football Podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Really appreciate your ranking us on iTunes. You can still do so if you feel compelled. Also looking for more written out reviews on iTunes. If you have a few moments, they really help here for the little podcast that could. Wanted to mention off the top that I've been doing some player videos. If you're used to seeing me in those short videos last year on ESPN that I shot from my couch here at home, I'm doing the same thing this year, and we're putting them on a YouTube channel. You can go to harrisfootball.com and click videos and subscribe to the channel if you feel so compelled. All right, so we've had a preseason game. Woohoo! And that preseason game was predictably horrible to watch, and we basically learned nothing other than Steelers kicker Sean Sweesum, right out of the gate, might have suffered a serious knee injury, which did cause me to redo my kicker ranks this Monday morning. I think you probably know my stance on this if you've ever heard me on a podcast before. The preseason is hot garbage. Do not draw many conclusions based on what you see, and not just the Hall of Fame game. In general, I beg you, the preseason is not the place to make your opinions. Just let's hope that the good players, the ones we're thinking of drafting, don't get hurt. Let's hope everyone doesn't get hurt. All right, let's get to this show.
Today's kickoff.
This is the only show all preseason we're going to dedicate to defenses. I'll talk about why that is in a few minutes. First, we will touch on some brief injury news. I've got a small digression about a couple art house movies. Got an email of the day. And then my pal Jim McCormick will come on and we'll talk about defense strategy, which team defenses look interesting to him this year. And we'll also touch on IDP, both talking about strategy and specific players, including where you should be drafting J.J. Watt. So first off, some injury discussion. Arian Foster, the player about whom most has been said on this podcast so far. There's optimism, apparently, that Arian Foster's sports hernia surgery might require only 4 to 6 weeks, and he could avoid the PUP list. At this point, I certainly can't draft him, as if that's definitely the case. For now, he stays at my number 34 running back spot with Alfred Blue at number 39, but as always, we'll stay tuned. Brashad Perryman, the rookie Ravens receiver, as of this recording, still has not been able to practice. The Ravens haven't ruled him out of their preseason opener on Thursday, so I have, to this point, resisted the temptation to drop him from the spot where I have him, which is 32nd among wide receivers, but lowering his rank could definitely be coming. Fred Jackson is supposed to miss a couple of weeks with a hamstring injury. This was probably the year with Shady McCoy in Buffalo that Jackson's fantasy relevance finally trended towards zero, but this is sort of pushing him in that direction. A little better news, Martavis Bryant, the Steelers receiver, had his cast removed from the elbow on which we had a procedure to clear out an infection, and apparently he did drills on Sunday. I'm still maintaining some faith in Bryant that he'll be draftable ahead of Marcus Wheaton, but I reserve the right to change my mind. We'll see how the next couple weeks go. Josh Hill, the Saints tight end, who's expected to help replace Jimmy Graham in New Orleans, has apparently missed some time in camp, but they haven't said what the injury is, but now appears to be at least taking a little bit of a backseat to Ben Watson in that New Orleans offense. Now, normally, you know, I would not care at all about what reporters' opinions are about who looks good or who's ahead of who on some first week depth chart in training camp. But in this case, I'm going to pay a little bit of attention because Hill hasn't done it before except for very sporadically last year. I'm to the point now where I can't really even think of Josh Hill as all that good of a sleeper. There's still, again, plenty of time in training camp to raise him back up, but I actually did lower him. He's down to number 24 in my tight end ranks. All right, so let's talk about defense, and I'll just say it up front. As long as your league doesn't have some kind of exotic scoring system or salary structure, I have to try to convince you not to even consider taking a defense until the last couple rounds of your draft and not to consider spending more than $1 or $2 in your auction. I know what the temptation is. Here you are, you've filled out the rest of your starting lineup, you've heard all summer about how great the Seahawks defense will continue to be, so why not spend an early pick on their defense? Well, let me spend a few minutes here telling you why you should not. First of all, even if you accept that you're good at picking out which the best defenses will be, which, as I'll show in a little while, you're not as good as you think you are, how much are the best defenses really worth? In last Thursday's tight end preview show, I gave you a mini disquisition on value-based drafting, which is a fancy way of comparing the value of different positions. It's based on scarcity. The scarcer a position is, the more value we attach to the best players at that position. Well, obviously in most leagues, defenses aren't very scarce. The Bills were fantasy's number 1 defense last year. I'm looking it up, scored 170 fantasy points, and that's 47 points more than the baseline defense in a 12-team league. Meanwhile, the best running backs, they'll be like 200 points better than the baseline running back. I know how it feels when the Seahawks give you that really big game and win you a week, but the fact is, on average, they aren't more than a few points better than lesser defenses on a weekly basis. Still, I admit, if we could, without fail, predict which defenses would wind up at the top by the end of the season, it would be smart to take them earlier than round 15 or spend more than $1 or $2 on them in an auction. The problem is, as I hinted earlier, we stink at it. We stink at it for 2 reasons. First, team defense scoring in fantasy is capricious.
Eye roll.
So much of it comes from special teams touchdowns, even defensive touchdowns. History tells us those touchdowns are really random. I don't think anyone would look at last year's Philadelphia Eagles defense and call it elite. They were 28th in total yards allowed, 31st in pass yards allowed, 22nd in points allowed. And no, those stats aren't perfect by any means. I know the Eagles offense goes fast and that puts some pressure on the Philly defense. But probably more revealing is that the Eagles themselves got rid of their top 3 corners from last year. Kerry Williams, Bradley Fletcher, and now Brandon Boykin are gone from Philly. It was not a good defense. And it finished second in fantasy points. Largely, they had some sacks, but largely because of 7 special teams touchdowns added to 4 defensive touchdowns. If you had Philly's defense and special teams with 11 touchdowns before the season started in 2014, and by the way, that turned out to be 5 more than the second most, and turned out to be 57% of Philly's defense's fantasy points. Well, if you had that to start the year, I suggest you stop listening to the podcast and move to Las Vegas. The second reason we stink at picking defenses before the season starts is because it's actually really hard. Let's put aside fantasy scoring. It's just hard to predict which the very best defenses are going to be before the season starts, before we have film. The proof actually is in numbers. Last year, the Panthers' defense was taken second among all defenses and finished 19th. 49ers, they went third. They finished 10th. Broncos went fourth. They finished 11th. The Bengals went 5th, and they finished 24th. So I did a little spreadsheet magic in advance of this show, and I looked back over the past 5 years. There are way more absolute duds taken among the top 5 defenses than there are home runs. Yes, I admit, the Seahawks did wind up looking okay by the end of last year, but anybody who drafted them last year remembers what it was like. They started terribly. After 7 weeks of the 2014 season, the Seahawks defense was 22nd in fantasy points. If you took them at the end of the 4th round, which on average, that's where they were taken in a 12-team draft, they were 48th overall, you were relying on them to win you games. And in those first 2 months, they didn't, and actually probably put your fantasy team in a hole for the regular season crown in your league. All right, so I just spent like 5 minutes talking about defense, and I'm guessing that many of the listeners of this podcast have been convinced long ago. They already agree that defenses are way too variable, way too random, not nearly scarce enough in fantasy leagues to bother taking them before the 14th or 15th round or spending more than $1 or $2 in your auction. But as a public service, I wanted to try and convince the rest of you it isn't worth grabbing a defense when you've filled out the rest of your starting lineup. Let other people take a defense early. Chuckle. Rub your hands together in glee. It doesn't matter. You'll get whoever you get in your draft. You'll see how it works out. And then you'll drop them. If it doesn't work out, you grab someone else. I mentioned that the Bills wound up as fantasy's #1 defense last year. Well, before the season started, they were rated 16th, meaning they were a free agent in most 12-team leagues. Heed my words. Do not reach for a defense.
Hey, Chris, tell us what obscure movie you saw this week.
Sorry, Ember, that was a total lie. I'm going to talk about 2 movies, one of which I have not yet seen, but I'm looking forward to it, and one that I saw longer than a week ago, but I have not mentioned. The one that I think is really good, and it's my favorite movie of the year so far, realizing, you newcomers to this podcast, that I am kind of an artistic snob, is Clouds of Sils Maria. It's Juliette Binoche, and believe it or not, Kristen Stewart, who is really good in this movie. It's about an aging actress who helped stage a revival of the play that made her famous 20 years ago when she played the younger role in the play. It's just really good. It's smart and funny. It's not an action movie. It does have a really mean send-up of kind of Avengers-style movies in it. Chloe Grace Moretz is in it, and she plays a kind of a pop icon, the kind that Kristen Stewart actually is. Anyway, I recommend it. I believe it's streaming pretty much everywhere. You should see it if you are looking for an arty movie. And then the one I'm looking forward to and wish I had seen in advance of this podcast is The End of the Tour. It's not out where I am, but it is open in limited release in major cities. This is the movie about David Foster Wallace, an series of interviews that he gave at the end of his book tour for Infinite Jest. If you are a long-time podcast listener of mine, you know David Foster Wallace is well nigh my favorite writer, certainly one of them, and Infinite Jest is a book that I hold very near and dear. I've read it a few times and love it very much, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing The End of the Tour. So if you've seen that one, you can tweet me at Harris Football, let me know what you thought. And you're not going to dissuade me from seeing it, so you might as well just tell me it's great. But I am looking forward to seeing Jason Segel take on the role of David Foster Wallace. And as I mentioned, The Clouds of Sils Maria is terrific.
Email of the day.
Now there's an accurate bumper for you, because this definitely is the email of the day from Gourmet Spud, who writes, I saw Chris working at a Starbucks in Edmonton last May. It looked just like him, except he had a mustache and glasses that were obviously fake. I said, hey, you're Chris Harris. He got really defensive and said that he wasn't. I insisted and asked for an early flag plant for the upcoming season, but he just kept shaking his head while silently mouthing something that may have been witness protection. Later, when I went to toss my latte away, I noticed some writing on the bottom of the cup. It read simply, Vincent Jackson, 3 flags.
Today's guest.
Today's guest is Jim McCormick. Thank you for coming on, Jim.
Thank you for having me on, Chris. I'm excited to be on here.
Cool. So Jim is a good pal of mine from ESPN days. You can follow him on Twitter at @JMcCormickESPN, which you should because he's funny. So Jim, I just spent the first few minutes of the show totally bashing the idea of taking team defense earlier than like 14th or 15th round. You spend more time than I do. You probably spend more time than most humans on the planet do analyzing NFL defenses. but I presume you are basically on board with not taking the Seahawks, for example, at their current average draft position, which is like the 9th round.
Yeah, no, I definitely am of the streaming, variety. I basically last year, if you took Seattle, it was a really rough start. 4 out of the first 6 games, they were 17th or worst in terms of fantasy finish, in those particular weeks. The Oakland Raiders had a better start. They outscored in individual weeks the first 2 out of 3 weeks. So that would be that would feel pretty salty to have invested such capital and passed on. The idea of taking a defense that high it's not too different than taking a tight end high, or you feel like you're scrambling the rest of the draft to make up for the depth that you're really giving up starting talent on offense. You're not giving up any, that's really the option that you're trading in. And so Seattle, they could continue to be a quality defense. They're still going to end up in the top 3 or 4. They have the last, 3 straight seasons, but that still doesn't, validate taking them so high that basically they have to be historic almost, to talk about how you talk about VBD. They have to be historic in order to ever pay that back, and that's really rare. That's like 2006 Chicago Bears type stuff.
I'm with you, and you really sort of reprising exactly my argument from the top of the show, so great minds are thinking alike. So let's assume we've sort of beaten that into people's heads. It doesn't mean that it's not fun to talk about defenses. And to prepare ourselves, I think most importantly, for what we might see on tape once the games actually start. Let's talk about that Seahawks defense. So that secondary, Byron Maxwell's gone. You've got him in Philly. Right. Earl Thomas coming off shoulder surgery. Jeremy Lane out indefinitely. We saw the Super Bowl injury. There's holdouts in that secondary that, they're going to resolve themselves. They'll be fine. Do you buy that there's any uncertainty in that secondary and therefore uncertainty in that defense?
There's the potential for it. It's still early for that, and Cam Chancellor's not very happy.
Right. Richard Sherman apparently not that happy, yeah. Yeah,
Michael Bennett's not happy. Now, this is not the secondary, but there is a link between, your best pressure creator and your secondary. But I think you're still going to be seeing a defense that's, wickedly productive. I still think you're in a division where you're going to have some, it seems like you're talking about some of the more conservative plotting offenses. Now, that's anecdotal, but at the same time, those division games sometimes can help you in terms of familiarity and how the Seahawks will produce. But in general, I don't think the turnover or any of the questions at secondary are as much the issue as the ADP is.
Yeah.
It's true that there could be some issues, and we've seen it happen with San Francisco. We've seen it happen with top defenses in the past, really just successful teams where retaining and keeping everybody happy becomes increasingly difficult because now, more guys are getting asked to be at photo shoots than just Richard Sherman.
Yeah.
There's more demand on celebrity and time and all these things, and that does affect things. In a workforce, I think we don't think about these situations as workforces or as, kind of like a cobble of personalities that have to work together. But beyond all that guessing and anecdotal stuff, I really do just think they're going to be a top 5 fantasy defense.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, last year they were a top 5 fantasy defense, and they had as many top 10 finishes in fantasy as the Colts did.
Wow. They were just more consistent on the back end. Yeah, they didn't have as many
didn't have as many disaster
terrible
games,
games,
right? But
yeah.
every team that I charted, I went through last year's finishes, every team had at least 2 finishes outside the top 20. And that's true with quarterback and all these other things, but some people view defense as this set it and forget it thing, and obviously it's just not. The results just tell us it's not.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I'll just say that when your number 2 corner is Kerry Williams, I believe you may have some experience.
Yes.
With a team, you're an Eagles fan, and knowing that Kerry Williams is looking like the number 2 corner in Philly, and Will Blackman is looking like the number 3 corner.
Right.
I have some doubt. I have them rated 2, so don't get me wrong. I'd still take them, but not where, like you said, not where they're being drafted. But I have some doubt.
Yeah, so if that's the case, then maybe there's more potential. Maybe there's more potential for games that get away from them, or games where, one of the greater influences on fantasy point production is that they set us up naturally to lose points as our defense gives up points. And
right.
I could see there being more of an issue with point allowance because that's just knowing knowing the corners that are there now.
Yes.
Or Bradley Fletcher in New England. Like it's really interesting that
it's the Eagles diaspora, right? It's the Eagles. Yeah.
That's Chip Kelly's real plan, is to pawn off horrible corners to like the competent teams and slowly degrade the secondaries around the league.
Right, because he does such a good job showcasing how terrible they are, and it really makes them attractive.
They're like, Chip, trust them, it must work.
Right. All right, so we've agreed that waiting until the very end of your draft or your auction is the right way to go. Do you have a favorite team defense that you're willing to snap up sort of near the end while everyone else goes in a different direction?
I generally try to look for, and again, strength of schedule, we're in a lot of ways guessing. But I do think that there is some year-to-year turnover, especially if you're like in specific situations where offenses aren't going to make huge leaps. At least some won't. I don't suspect that the Jaguars all of a sudden are a top, 15 offense. I can see them continuing to be a valuable team to pursue. That being said, I kind of want to look at teams that start pretty strong. Start of the season, you have like the Dolphins. Their ADP is past 10. They've been top 12 in the last 3 years in sacks per opponent's attempt, so they're a fairly consistent sack producer. They're only adding a better interior rush with Sue. And then they start off with Washington, the Jaguars, the Bills, and the Jets. Now they have a bye after that, but then they go on to play the Titans and Texans. And I think I told you this before, but that's a strong slate as far as we can predict or we can guess how offenses performed last year. And the Colts, again, they're coming up again. They are a team also that has a fairly good pass rush. I wonder how much of that plays into the fact that, their offense can compel opponents to pass often. Mm-hmm. But again, they have a pretty nice sack per attempt rate, and they start off with the Bills and the Jets and the Titans, the Jags, and the Texans. So it's a pretty similar start. I also think that Carolina might be, like in your ranks, I think Carolina might just be a tad low.
Okay.
I think they're a team who, over the last 3 years, has the third most top 10 appearances. They have really talented linebackers. I think their pass rush comes back a little bit with Coney Ealy, the young guy. So those are teams that I would target late because they're going to allow you to have a comfortable start where, say, the first at least the first weekend, you're not really going to be, hunting. The first 2 weeks, you're not going to be hunting on the wire. Maybe you can focus on, the Victor Cruz of this year, or whoever might step up that you might be able to place that fab budget or that waiver wire where everybody else might be still scrambling for the matchup defense.
So we went, Dolphins, Colts, Panthers.
Yes.
Okay.
And the Browns also start off with the Jets and the Titans and Raiders, and the Browns actually, have a fairly good personnel set. I just still wonder about pass rush.
I'll give you another one. I like the Vikings. They're number 6 on my list for defenses for the year. ADP-wise, they're going like 19, I think.
Yeah.
49ers week 1 doesn't look too scary, and I'm with you. Looking at week 1 and week 2 is a smart way to think about this because, listen, I can be a lot more use on this podcast. You can be a lot more use in what you write once we start seeing tape. Our thing isn't that defenses are completely these total mysteries, and throughout the entire season it's going to be, we're unfrozen caveman lawyer who's scared of what they see. Our point is that until we see that tape, we're sort of floundering around, we're guessing. And so I'm with you. Those first couple of weeks, maybe you take it on faith that there's some bad offenses. Everson Griffin finally popped. Last year he played really well. He had several multiple sack games. He had 12 for the year. Anthony Barr, really good as a rookie. I just like Mike Zimmer a lot.
I love him.
They're relying on Terrence Newman, who's like 106 years old, but I think they're going to wind up being good and a nice sort of, I'll just wait and take them in the 15th round.
Yeah, they're definitely need to help hide Newman. That's like the one glaring thing on the depth chart, but
right.
I completely agree with you. Like, my favorite is how Zimmer talks about it. He calls it sugaring the A-gaps, like sweetening the A-gaps, because he's going to send Barr and Kendricks and even Chad Greenway. Like, he's going to send all these guys up the middle. And as we know, like, middle pressure really creates havoc.
Especially against Colin Kaepernick.
Exactly. And, he'll flush around, and Everson Griffin and Brian Robinson will be waiting there to hug him.
One more team defense I'd like to talk about is the Jets, because, they're getting an awful lot of love, and we understand why. Revis comes back, and that is the rising tide that lifts all boats. This is a defense that's finished 27th in fantasy points last year, especially when Sheldon Richardson is such an important part of that defense, and he's not going to be there for at least 4 games. I think at this point probably more. He just got arrested again while on suspension. Do you think Revis is enough to instantly make these guys like a contender for the number 1 overall defense?
I don't. No, I don't. And a lot of it comes down to like the personnel. I mean, Bowles, I think, is going to be aggressive, but so was, Rex Ryan runs a fairly aggressive blitz-heavy scheme. So they create pressure last year. They were fairly good at creating pressure, but it didn't result in any numbers. They had the 25th average finish last year. They only had 2 top 10 finishes. So, no, it's going to help, but the idea that like Revis went and helped the Patriots is kind of like an insult to Jamie Collins and Chandler Jones and all these other playmakers that the Patriots claim.
Right.
And also this guy Belichick, who's been known to do a couple things with defensive adaptation. So I'm not a fan of the Jets in terms of picking them up. I think Revis helps.
Yeah.
And maybe in terms of creating some pressure, but really, who's their edge guy? Like, especially like you said, with Richardson out. I like Leonard Williams and Wilkerson's a nice player, but Sheldon Richardson's probably one of the best 5 linemen in the league.
Yeah, I agree. Not between the ears, but on the field. Let's talk IDP. So first I wanted to talk setup. My contention throughout this entire podcast so far, apparently it's the number 1 thing I've said, is the way to make position matter in fantasy is to inject scarcity. So having like 1 IDP player or 2 IDP players per team in your fantasy league, that's not making them very scarce. So I wonder if we've got folks who are listening they're maybe thinking of making a change and changing their league format and including IDP. What would be the kind of format that you would recommend?
I would try to approach it more that it's almost you're trying to recreate an offensive roster on defense.
Yeah.
Not that it needs to be as large scale. You don't have to have 10 starting spots, but I generally try to do, we generally break down IDP in the 3 major position groups: defensive line, defensive back, and linebacker.
Right.
I like to have 2 of each.
As starters.
And then also like maybe 2 utilities, which some people call 2 linebackers. That gives you 8 players to choose from. And if you're, going out to a 12-team league, you at least are owning a good size. But it's like, you're right though. If you have a single IDP player, that's like a single receiver league.
Right.
It's going to be just it's an all pro collection on everybody's team. Everybody's going to have like a stud middle linebacker. And it really devalues the idea of even taking a Luke Kuechly or taking a J.J. Watt, because there's not really a great margin you're creating because the other guy has a superstar as well. So,
right.
Plus
the waiver wire is so
it's so rich.
Yeah, you can always find someone, and that's boring, right?
Yeah, the highest scoring player for the year will be on the waiver wire probably,
right.
like literally. So, and the whole idea of IDP is to differentiate your experience and really open up a whole new player base.
Yeah, I agree. I think something like 6 or 8 starters is the right way to go if you're going to do an IDP league. So let's talk individual players. J.J. Watt, number 1 for you IDP-wise, and if so, where should he be taken if you're in a league with some real significant IDP scarcity?
Yeah, he's pretty ridiculous. I know your takes on Gronk, and they're quite valid, but he's the same kind of idea where the margin is so large. That's the argument for him, that the margin between him and the subsequent class of players is so large. He scores 55% more fantasy points in the format I generally use. And he's going to have scored at least 40% or more in almost any format than JPP last year, in terms of linemen. So he's just a massive increase. The honest truth is he's going to go too high for me and for the majority of like seasoned IDP players.
Yeah.
Just because he's going in like the 3rd round in standard drafts.
Right. That's crazy.
And there's not great ADP data, but I've done enough drafts that hopefully I can, give some sort of idea of where the winds belong. And he's going too high because he's awesome and he's the most well-known name on defense, and the NFL 100, he was the number 1 player. So it's quite hard to miss him. And again, in a new league, I'm not trying to insult any new IDP players. Welcome to the fray. But they often will jump too quickly into the huge name. He is a great advantage, but where you're taking him creates a disadvantage elsewhere. So he does go in the 3rd. If you're in an auction, it wouldn't, maybe there's a more realistic way to get him.
Right. Basically, MVP, defensive MVP, 2 of the last 3 years, his value is essentially too high unless you've got a bunch of very savvy owners, all of whom want to wait, which,
is rare.
Yeah, not too many leagues like
and
that.
And the touchdowns, the fade routes kind of got people a little hype, and many leagues don't even reward that. So, I'd be wary of that.
Right, check to make sure that offensive touchdowns count for your defensive players, because that is not always the case.
Especially when you tell everybody in the chat room, like, plus he catches touchdowns, and the commissioner's like, no, he doesn't.
Right. Yeah, no, and I mean, of course, this is the requisite moment in the podcast where I'm going to get 100 tweets fired off to me saying, what about him as a tight end? Shouldn't I be thinking about him as a tight end? And the answer is, yeah, that's great. Go ahead. Except for no, don't.
All
do
those
that.
Mike Vrabel years. Let's just remember.
The huge Mike Vrabel fantasy years where he was the number 3 tight end in for, wait a minute. So progressing sort of along the IDP ranks, how far below? I assume Luke Kuechly, maybe your number 2 overall IDP player. He's going significantly after Watt, though.
He is. It's a massive gap, and it's a greater gap than you see, say, from Gronk and the rest of the class. It's quite dramatic. Like you're going into the middle rounds. You're going into the 6th and 7th round when you start seeing the Kuechlys and the Levante Davids start to show up, and that's not too criminal. It's just that the thing is that it is more like receiver. It's not a single position in the sense that many teams provide you 2 fantasy-worthy. We just talked about the Vikings. There's going to be several weeks where Anthony Barr gets a sack or 2, multiple sacks. He's got that potential. Eric Hendricks is going to be so the point being, we can get multiple defenders from many teams, so the talent pool is pretty rich. So I'd be, again, like, I don't want to be the ultimate conservative, tell you to keep waiting guy, but I really do think you can. I'm not saying wait till the absolute end. It's not team defense because these guys.
That's right.
But I would wait until maybe you are pretty confident. You don't have to have your third receiver. You don't have to have your tight end if you're waiting on that. You don't even really have to have your quarterback. But I would try to have some semblance of like a running back, wide receiver core where those positions, particularly running back, we see a pretty big degradation in quality as the draft goes on.
That's right. So for me as well, when I'm in an IDP draft, I'm not going to wind up with Watt. I'm not going to wind up with Kuechly. I'm not going to wind up with David. And, I usually am one of the last owners in an IDP league to start taking defensive players, and there are still plenty of good ones. You're not going to get the absolute biggest names, but plenty of good ones. And, so for me, I'm thinking no IDP player in an auction for me is getting more than a few bucks. No IDP player for me in a draft is going higher than the 10th round. I'm going to stack up that way. So strategy-wise, defensive backs, even though the corners are the big names and you know them, you got to be thinking safeties. They're the ones who get tackles. So safeties are almost always going to be rated above corners. Who are some linebackers you think might emerge in 2015 after not having had really big tackle totals last year?
He came on late. He didn't have the hugest tackle totals, but Telvin Smith for Jacksonville. He's a guy going as an LB2, LB3 even, like a third linebacker for a lot of leagues, which in many senses is almost a free linebacker. He was 25th last year in fantasy points per snap. The Jaguars run out their linebackers for 3 downs. They just keep them out there. He's a bit undersized, but that can help him because he's one of those, outside linebackers who's just a speed maven, and he's at the ball. He racks up a lot of tackles, and again, not guessing game flow too heavily, but teams ran a lot against Jacksonville last year, especially in the second half of games, and that can tend to feed these like big 10, 13 tackle games. Everybody else is going to pay for Paul Posluszny and expect that same kind of result, but Telvin Smith is really cheap. He's a speedster from Florida State, second-year guy. I think he's valuable. I think Khalil Mack is a guy who the fantasy numbers didn't really show up last year, but like all the on tape, he was amazing. Yeah. And he was second only behind Von Miller in pressures created among 4-3 linebackers. He's sent to the pocket over 80% of the time. So this is an aggressive usage of this guy. And I really do think that you're going to see kind of an explosion. Like I would bet that his 4 sacks turn into 8. Like I would bet like almost a complete doubling of his success in the past. And if you have a linebacker getting 100 tackles and 8 sacks, that's like Darrell Washington before he lost it.
Very good. Jim, thank you much for doing this. You can follow Jim on Twitter. Please do, at McCormick ESPN. Thanks again, Jim.
Thanks so much, Chris. This has been a great show.
And that's it. That's our show. Thank you very much for listening. Tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, is the veteran auction for La Liga Lebowski, the Dynasty League that I spoke of on Friday. You can follow along in part with that auction at La Liga Lebowski. That is not me who maintains that account, but it is fun. And then tomorrow for Tuesday's show, I will have John Anik on, another friend of mine from longer ago ESPN days, and he is the defending champion in La Liga, and we'll talk about how his auction went and what his experience in general and his expectations in general for La Liga are this year. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll catch you tomorrow.
The Harris Football Podcast's opening theme is Under the Gun by Apex Manor. The end theme is Tooth and Claw by OU Villain. Subscribe to the Harris Football Podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode.